Dr. Bhaskaran sir to proceed with e-posters.
Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Welcome.
Yeah, so I request all the postgraduates, there should be note of 3 minutes for the presentation and 2 minutes for the discussions. Please proceed, sir. Thank you, sir.
Good evening. Greetings from MBJ Medical College. I welcome all the society members, president, secretary, and all faculty and the postgraduate students. Let us start the proceedings of my presentations from MBJ Medical Institutions. I request my colleague, Dr. Prithviraj, to go ahead with the presentation, please, for BGS.
So they have to share the screen, sir.
Yes.
Yeah.
Prithviraj.
So I welcome Dr. Rohit Kumar to judge the session. Rohit, you are here?
Thank you, Harish. I am there.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we start?
Yeah.
Who will be timing it? Harish, any?
We will time it. We will do that. We will time it. Right.
Okay, Harish. Thank you. Dr. Sudarshan, you are there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please start your presentation.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Sudarshan V. Is the screen visible to everybody?
Yeah, your screen is visible. You're audible. Please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Good evening to one and all. My name is Dr. Sudarshan V, final year postgraduate from MBJ Medical College. I would like to extend my regards to the President, Honorary Secretary, all the senior consultants and postgraduates present in this particular event. I would also like to thank my HOD, Dr. Bhaskaran, for giving us opportunity to present the case in the monthly clinical meet. Today, I'll be presenting a poster on an inguinal surprise, that is Amen's hernia.
Dr. Sudarshan, you have to be a bit louder.
Yes, sir. A 70-year-old male presented to us with swelling in the right inguinoscrotal region since the last 6 months, which was initially approximately measuring 4 into 3 centimeters and was reducible. For the past 15 days, the swelling increased in size and had become irreducible. The patient also complained of pain over the swelling since the last 15 days. The patient gives a history of undergoing a hernia surgery 8 years ago. On examination, the swelling measured 5 into 6 centimeters in size, extending into the root of the scrotum, irreducible and firm in consistency. No cough impulse was present and tenderness was present over the swelling. Ultrasound abdomen pelvis was done, which showed a 2 centimeter defect in the right inguinal region with inflamed bowel as its contents with an absent cough impulse. With the above diagnosis, with the provisional diagnosis of obstructed inguinal hernia, the patient was posted for a herniorrhaphy under spinal anesthesia. The first image shows the hernial sac here. The second image shows the, after dissecting the hernial sac, we can see the appendix. The tip of the appendix is enclosed within the omental mass. Intraoperative findings showed a thickened omental mass with pus and perforated appendix was noted. The base of the appendix was noted at the deep inguinal ring, and the appendicectomy was done and the stump was pushed in, and herniorrhaphy was done following Little's repair. Coming to the discussion, Amen's hernia is defined as an inguinal hernia containing the vermiform appendix, whether the appendix is normal, inflamed, or perforated. It is named after the surgeon Claudius Amen, who in 1735 performed an appendectomy on an 11-year-old boy with a perforated appendix incarcerated in an inguinal hernial sac. The incidence of Ameyans hernia is about 0.4 to 1% of all the hernias. Acute appendicitis in Ameyans hernia is about 1.1%. Ameyans hernia is classified according to the vermiform appendix characteristics into type A, type B, and type C. Type A is appendix without signs of inflammation. Type B is appendix with signs of inflammation, and type C is perforated appendix. The differential diagnosis includes strangulated inguinal hernia, testicular torsion, and acute
Time
epididymitis.
is up. Please conclude, Sudarshan.
Treatment for type A and type B is tension-free mesh hernioplasty. For type C is herniorrhaphy along with appendectomy. Acute appendicitis in recurrent inguinal hernia is very rare, and so far only 2 cases have been reported. These are my references. Thank you.
Sudarshan, which side did the patient had surgery initially?
Sir, right side, sir.
Right side only?
Yes, sir.
What was the initial repair done?
So the details of it was not there, sir. Probably a herniorrhaphy was done, sir.
Okay, is it possible to have a Ameyans hernia on the left side?
No, sir.
Not possible?
No, no, sir. Sorry, sir. It can be possible in situs inversus, sir.
Anything else? Okay, what will you do for a type A Ameyans hernia on the left side?
Sir, appendectomy with mesh hernioplasty, sir.
Appendicectomy you do, and still you do a hernioplasty or herniorrhaphy? What will you do?
Sir, hernioplasty, sir, because it is a type A, it is not inflamed.
But still you're opening the bowel, right? You're converting a clean surgery into a
Infected, yes, sir.
clean contaminated surgery, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What will you call a femoral hernia in a appendix in a femoral hernia?
De Gringot's hernias.
Okay. What was the initial management that you did for this patient clinically?
So clinically, we did resuscitation first, followed by which we had got all routine investigations, and then we had taken up the patient. So we tried to try to reduce, but it was not possible.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dr.
Dr. Sudarshan.
Thank you, sir.
Next, we have Mohammed Rashid. He's a final year postgraduate resident. And he's presenting a poster on jejunal intussusception.
Lakshman sir.
Yeah. Yes, Rohit.
Sir, Lakshman sir, and sir, please, if you have any questions, you can ask, sir. My general surgery is little very far away, but I've read some things and I'm asking questions.
You're doing
Sure,
a great
sure,
job. Just
sure.
go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Rashid, you can start.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Mohammed Rashid, junior resident from MVJ Medical College. I'll be presenting a case of jejunal intussusception secondary to jejunal lipomatosis. Our patient, a 48-year-old male, presented to us with history of abdominal pain since 1 week, which was colicky and intermittent and associated with 2 episodes of vomiting. Patient had no history of constipation, diarrhea, or fever. Patient also gave history of similar episodes of colicky abdominal pain since 10 years, for which he didn't take any medications or consultation and used to get relieved on its own. Patient did not have any history of surgeries in the past. On examination, his vitals were within normal limits. Per abdominal examination showed upper abdominal distension, diffuse tenderness, and there was no rigidity or guarding. The bowel sounds were sluggish. An X-ray of the erect abdomen showed dilated small bowel loops, and the ultrasound showed dilated small bowel loops with sluggish peristalsis and reduced vascularity. The patient was further investigated with a contrast-enhanced CT scan, which showed multiple jejunal lipomas with jejunal-ileal intussusception and free fluid in the abdomen. The patient underwent a midline laparotomy under general anesthesia. On entering the abdomen, we found an intussusception in the proximal bowel, which was delivered into the wound and spontaneously reduced partially. The intussusception was completely reduced manually. After reduction of the intussusception, a gangrenous bowel of approximately 80 centimeter of length was noted, which was resected, and jejunal anastomosis was done in 2 layers. Post-operatively, the patient did well, and histopathology confirmed the diagnosis of jejunal lipomatosis. Coming to the discussion, intussusception in adulthood is uncommon, with an incidence of almost 2 to 3 cases per population of 1 million per year, whereas it is the most common cause of intestinal obstruction in infants. In contrast to pediatric intussusceptions, which is idiopathic in 90% of the cases, adult intussusception has an organic lesion in 70 to 90% of the cases. In adults, only 1% of bowel obstructions are caused by intussusception, and neoplasms are the most common cause of intussusception in adults, majority of which are malignant. And lipomas make up only 1 to 2% of all gastrointestinal tumors, and they most commonly occur in the colon, followed by small bowel and occasionally in the stomach. Among small bowel lipomas, ileal lipomas are the most common and represent 50%, while jejunal lipomas are the least common. Lipomas are usually solitary tumors, but in only 5% of the cases, small bowel lipomas could be multiple. Clinically, intussusception in adults usually has a subacute or chronic onset, and the classic pediatric presentation of acute intussusception, which includes a triad of cramping abdominal pain, bloody diarrhea.
Rashid, your time is up.
You can
Can you
conclude.
conclude?
Sorry, sir.
Can you conclude? Your time is up.
Yes, sir. So from our experience, adult patients commonly present with non-specific symptoms such as long-standing colicky abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, distension, and gastrointestinal bleeding.
Please
These are my references.
Okay, Rashid,
Thank you.
how far was your jejunal anastomosis from the DJ flexure?
Sir, the intussusception started from 10 centimeter distal to the DJ flexure, and
Okay.
80 centimeter of the jejunum was resected as it was non-viable.
My question is very specific. I am asking you, how far was your anastomosis from the DJ flexure?
Around 20 centimeters, sir.
From 20 centimeters.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you know anything about short gut syndrome?
Yes, sir. When the the leftover bowel after resection anastomosis is less than 2 meters, the nutrient absorption will be very less, and it will lead to a short gut syndrome.
How was the post-op recovery of the patient, Rashid?
Patient recovered very well, sir. He was taking orally from the 5th post-operative day, and he tolerated a diet very well, sir.
Any parenteral nutrition was given to the patient up to 5 days? Or how was the patient managed post-operatively?
Sir, the patient was kept nil per oral for the first 48 hours. Then we started with clear liquids and advanced was towards a full diet by post-operative day 5.
Okay, good. What do you consider is the ideal IV fluid for post-operative patient?
Sir, in the first post-operative day, we'll start with the Ringer's lactate and 5% dextrose.
What is the purpose of using dextrose, Rashid?
For providing enough calories.
Good. Thank you, Rashid.
Thank you, sir.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Venkat here.
Yes, sir.
What if you are to resect the DJ flexure in the surgery? If you had to resect the DJ flexure, you know, something close to a fixed part of the bowel, if you do anastomosis, there can be a leak. But what if you are anastomosis? What if the DJ flexure was also involved by some sort of tumor or some interception thing? What would you do?
Sir, then we would like to consider a Roux-en-Y anastomosis with the.
What will you do with the third part of duodenum? Where will you put it? If you faced it in practice, I'll tell you, we had 2 such cases. So we closed the duodenum third part or the fourth part because you cannot do anastomosis there. But you bring a Roux loop of the jejunum and anastomose it to the other end of the jejunum directly can be anastomosed to second part of the duodenum.
Yeah, thank you.
Duodenojejunectomy.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you.
So next we have Dr. Syed Saad. He's a second-year postgraduate resident, and he's going to present a poster on transanal barotrauma.
May I start, sir? Am I audible?
Please, Dr. Syed, please start.
Yeah. Good evening, respected President, Honorary Secretary, and Senior Consultants. I'm Dr. Syed Saad. I'll be presenting a poster on a case of retrosigmoid injury due to transcranial biotrauma. A 45-year-old male patient had presented to the emergency bay at MVG MCR and RH on 28th of July 2020. The chief complaints of distension of abdomen since 3 hours and pain abdomen since 3 hours. Patient gives history of transcranial insufflation of air by his colleagues by triggering a compressed air nozzle that is used to clean the floor playfully against his perineum at his workplace, following which he developed distension of abdomen, sudden onset, progressive, involving all the quadrants. Pain was sudden onset, progressive, constant dull aching pain all over the abdomen. On general physical examination, a middle-aged male patient who is moderately built and nourished, conscious, cooperative, and oriented to time, place, and person. On systemic examination of the abdomen, on inspection, there is a generalized distension of the abdomen, along with diffuse tenderness and guarding. Tympanic node were present all over the abdomen. Bowel sounds are absent. On a retinal examination, mucoid discharge was present, and no perineal tears were appreciated. External genitalia were normal. Here are the radiological investigations, that is the chest X-ray and heretic abdomen, shows massive pneumoperitoneum appreciated as air on the both domes of the diaphragm. The blood parameters and all preoperative routine investigations were within normal limits. A provisional diagnosis of hollow viscous perforation was made, and the patient was immediately taken for exploratory laparotomy. These are the intraoperative pictures. Following a lower midline laparotomy incision, there was immediate gushing of air with fecal and peritoneal contamination, which is appreciated. An immediate wash was given. A 4 centimeter longitudinal rupture at the rectosigmoid junction at the anti-mesenteric border with adjacent seromuscular tears were seen, as shown here in the intraoperative picture and the schematic diagram of the same. The primary closure of the ruptured segment was done in 2 layers. Following that, a diversion loop colostomy using the transverse colon was made, both shown intraoperatively and the schematic diagram. This is a postoperative day 12 picture showing of healthy and functioning stoma, along with the colostomy appliance which was put for the patient and secured. Post-operative period was uneventful. Stoma was healthy and functioning. Patient was discharged with advice for stoma closure after 3 months. Patient was readmitted on 11th of September, but unfortunately, patient had turned SARS-CoV-2 positive and was shifted to the COVID ward at MVG MCR and RH and was discharged subsequently, following which the patient was lost to follow-up. Under discussion, compressed air is widely used for industrial and domestic purposes. Since it stores large amount of energy at high pressure, its injudicious use may lead to grave incidents at workplace. Compressed air into the anorectum is a very short time can overcome barriers such as clothes and anal sphincter, delivering an enormous amount of compressed air into the rectum, resulting in rectal and colonic perforations and the development of tension pneumoperitoneum. Only 1 or 2 seconds is enough to deliver compressed air to cause major injury. Transcranial barotrauma due to compressed air leading to colonic injury was first reported in 1904, and especially in colonoscopy, 0.1 to 0.5% of the patients will show a colon barotrauma with perforation. Injuries can range from seromuscular tear to complete.
Dr. Saad, you can conclude.
Yeah, I would like to point out that this rectosigmoid junction is the most common point of perforation due to its fixation bilaterally. And usually surgical management reduces mortality to 42% from an original mortality of 65%.
Please note that when you're asked to conclude, you have to conclude. Otherwise, you lose marks.
Yes,
just conclude, and you have to.
Yes, sir.
You have to practice and make sure that you're well within the specified 3 minutes.
Understood.
It's a general request to all postgraduates. Please, when you're asked to conclude by the chairperson, please conclude.
Yes, sir. In this patient, we had done primary closure with transverse loop colostomy, being the usual operation of choice. These are my references, and I thank you. Any questions, please?
Okay. Dr. Syed?
Yes, sir.
What did you take your consent as before you go into surgery?
The consent was for an exploratory laparotomy proceed with the possibility of a colostomy requirement for the patient, and the colostomy, this thing was given, sir. That is the counseling for the patient.
In the emergency, were you able to counsel him?
So before the operation, we had an idea that this might be required for the patient. So pre-operatively, we had taken the consent following counseling, sir.
Where did you mark the stoma if you had planned for the stoma pre-operatively?
So,
what is the ideal place for a stoma?
So the upper left quadrant in case of a colostomy. That is 2 cm at the 2 centimeters from the midline through the rectus muscle, sir.
Okay. And you mentioned in your clinical history that patient was conscious and cooperative.
Yes, sir.
But you mentioned in your clinical signs he was having abdominal tenderness and guarding.
Yes, sir.
How frequently do you see patients with guarding and rigidity being cooperative to you?
So usually they're irritable, sir. But however, in this patient, he had presented early, so he was still conscious and cooperative, and vitals were stable, sir.
Did he have guarding?
So yes, sir. Diffuse guarding was appreciated, sir.
Okay. And how was the recovery of the patient?
So the patient was allowed.
Okay, sorry, I forgot. So what did you tell the patient when he was going to the going back regarding stoma?
So regarding stoma care, he was told to keep both the skin and the surrounding stoma healthy. He was told about the complications that could occur, such as necrosis or prolapse or obstruction of the same, sir. He was told to report in case of any obstructive symptoms and in case of any discoloration of the stoma that would indicate the declining health of the same. And he was also told to maintain a healthy intake of fluids and electrolyte-rich fluids. And yes, sir. Those were the advices that were given, sir.
Okay,
And,
thank you. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Venkat here.
yes, sir.
When did you discharge the patient after the procedure?
So on the post-operative day 13, sir.
Day 13.
Day 13, yes, sir.
Now, when will the necrosis of the stoma happen after 13 days? If
Sorry,
at all
sir?
necrosis has to happen, it can happen in the early period, right?
Early period, yes,
The
sir.
problem is early, not later.
Yes, sir.
Obstruction, delayed obstructions are also not usual. What you should ask them is look for the volume of the stoma,
Yes.
whether they are going into electrolyte imbalance, whether they need
Yes.
salt intake, fluid intake, cut down onions to reduce the smell. If they can learn stoma irrigation, that would be good.
Yes, sir.
And also to take care of the stoma. Parastomal hernias or can happen, or stomal prolapse
Yes.
or retraction may happen more than stenosis or obstruction.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Sad. We'll
Yes,
call
thank you, sir.
to speak.
So next we have Dr. Akhila, who is going to be presenting a paper. She's going to be presenting a poster on Meckel's diverticle.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Akhila, second year postgraduate, and today I'll be presenting a poster on a case of perforated Meckel's diverticulum. A 26-year-old male presented to our casualty with complaints of pain abdomen around the umbilicus and right lower quadrants in 2 days. It was colicky in nature, gradually progressive, pain aggravated on ingestion of food. There were no any relieving factors. It was associated with 1 episode of moderate grade fever, no chills, also associated with 4 episodes of nausea and vomiting. The vomitus contained food particles, not blood or bile tinged. On examination, per abdomen showed guarding and rigidity in the right and the left iliac fossa, umbilical region with sluggish bowel sounds. Per rectal examination was normal. Blood parameters showed increased total leukocyte counts. USG abdomen pelvis showed free fluid in the peritoneum. Erect X-ray on my left-hand side shows the thin film of air under the diaphragm. The same is being showed in the chest X-ray also on the right-hand side. With the above mentioned findings, the diagnosis of hollow viscous perforation was made and patient was taken for an emergency expiratory laparotomy. A lower midline incision was taken. Intraoperatively, a perforation was noted at the base of the diverticulum. Here's the schematic diagram representing the same. Wedge resection and anastomosis was done along with appendicectomy. Postoperatively, postoperative period was uneventful. Histopathological examination showed signs of inflammation and no any evidence of heterotopic tissue. Coming to discussion, a Meckel's diverticulum is a persistent remnant of the vitellointestinal duct and is a true diverticular and is present in about 2% of the population, 2 feet away from the ileocecal valve, 2 inches long, and is usually present in the antemesenteric side of the ileum. The most common clinical presentations are hemorrhage, diverticulitis, intussusception, chronic ulceration, intestinal obstruction, and perforation. In children, it is usually gastrointestinal bleeding, and in adults, it is obstruction either due to adhesive glands or intussusception and rarely perforation. A perforated Meckel's diverticulum presents like an acute appendicitis with or without perforation, like fever, nausea, vomiting, right lower quadrant pain abdomen, and peritoneal signs. Often, Meckel's diverticulum is symptomatically indistinguishable from appendicitis as the disease process is identical. It should be looked for when a normal appendix is found during the surgery suspected for appendicitis. If a Meckel's is found incidentally at surgery, it can be left provided it has a wide mouth and is not thickened. A preoperative diagnosis of complicated Meckel's diverticulum can be challenging because of the overlapping clinical and imaging features and the acute surgical and inflammatory conditions of the abdomen. The treatment option in a complicated perforated Meckel's diverticulum remains surgical management. This case report is an unusual case of Meckel's diverticulum complication and highlights the importance of considering Meckel's diverticulum as a differential diagnosis. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Akila. Can you tell me what is Meckel's scan?
So Meckel's scan is a scintigraphy technetium 99 labeled scan, wherein the red blood cells are labeled. So if there's any acute gastrointestinal hemorrhage due to Meckel's diverticulum, it can be picked up.
Can you tell me when will you do a Meckel's scan for a childhood for conditions and for an adult? What is the differentiating factor? When is it indicated for a Meckel's scan for for children or for adults? When will you consider doing it?
So in children, when there is painless hematochezia, and in adults, if there is any melena and suspected for any intussusception due to Meckel's diverticulum.
Okay. How was the post-op recovery of the patient?
So post-operatively, it was uneventful. So patient improved well, sir.
When did you allow him orally?
So on post-op day 4, sir.
Day 4. Okay. So what was your fluid management? Can you tell me?
So initially we gave Ringer's lactate followed by 5% dextrose. First 48 hours, patient was nil per oral. So
how much was it? How much fluids were you giving?
So 5 pints at 120 ml per hour, sir.
120 ml per hour.
Yes, sir.
120 ml per hour for a how much for how many days?
So 2 days, sir.
Was it optimum, or do you think you are overrating the patient?
So it was optimum.
Optimum? What are the clinical signs or symptoms that you will see in a patient if you have overhydrated him?
So there will be crepes bilaterally. We can hear crepes.
Okay, then?
And there'll be coughing.
Okay, what will you see in the first post-operative day for this patient when you go for rounds? Important things what you will observe. What is the first thing you'll ask the patient?
So if the patient is passed flatus.
Do you think he'll pass flatus on the first day itself? Do you score pain in your hospital? Pain score?
Yes, sir, we do.
Okay, fine.
Thank you, Dr. Akila. We'll call next speaker.
Okay.
So next we have Dr. Panchami, who is a second-year postgraduate resident, and here she's about to tell you about a Houdini appendix.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Panchami, second-year postgraduate from MVJ Medical College and Research Hospital. I'll be presenting a case of appendicular agenesis. An 18-year-old female patient presented with a 5-day history of pain abdomen over right iliac fossa, which was initially present at the umbilical region. It was colicky, intermittent in nature, and radiating to the right iliac fossa, and was relieved on medications. It was associated with 1 episode of non-bilious vomiting, loss of appetite, and 1 episode of high-grade fever. There was no history of altered bowel movements. Menstrual cycles were normal and regular. She was a moderately built and nourished female patient, conscious, cooperative, well-oriented to time, place, and person. She had a tachycardia of 118 beats per minute, BP of 100 by 70 millimeter mercury, saturation of 100% on room air, temperature of 101 degrees Fahrenheit. She had a dry coated tongue. On per abdomen examination, her abdomen appeared scaphoid with all quadrants moving equally with respiration. There was no visible mass, peristalsis, or scars. On palpation, her abdomen was soft, right iliac fossa tenderness and guarding was present. And on percussion, a resonant note was heard. Auscultation showed normal peristaltic bowel sounds. Cardiovascular system and respiratory system were normal. A provisional diagnosis of acute appendicitis was made. Patient was admitted for further evaluation and management. USG abdomen and pelvis showed right iliac fossa probe tenderness and appendix could not be visualized. Erect X-ray abdomen showed no evidence of obstruction or perforation. Hemoglobin was 13.3 grams. Total counts was 14,600 cells per mmQ. Platelets was 2.86 lakhs. Urine routine showed a normal study. UPT was negative. RFT, LFT, serum electrolytes were within normal limits. The Alvarado scoring was 8 points and Ripasa scoring was 13 points. Both the scoring system were suggestive of acute appendicitis needing surgical intervention. So the patient was prepared and posted for an open appendicectomy. Access was gained through Lanz incision. Cecum, ileocecal junction, and tinea coli were identified, and peritoneal reflection was dissected to explore the retrocecal portion. Cecum was reflected and examined. After meticulous search, appendix could not be found at the confluence of the tinea. Ileum was inspected for the presence of Meckel's diverticulum, intussusception, submucosal lipomas, and mesentery was checked for mesenteric lymphadenitis. This is an intraoperative photograph showing the ileum, cecum, and the ileocecal junction where the appendix could not be found. Second opinion was taken from the senior staff. A diagnosis of acute appendicular agenesis was made. Final diagnosis was a non-specific pain abdomen with appendicular agenesis. Patient was treated with IV antibiotics and other supportive care. Post-operative stay was uneventful and patient was discharged in a stable state. Patient was advised for further investigations but was lost on follow-up. Appendicular agenesis was first reported by Morgagni in 1780s. Incidence is 1 in 100,000. Congenital absence of appendix is rare in general population. The cause of the absent appendix may be secondary to an intrauterine vascular accident. Arrest of development of appendix can occur at any stage. In type 1, there is absence of cecum and appendix.
Time up. Please conclude.
Appendicular agenesis is a rare condition. So if a patient has been found with an absent appendix, the patient has to be evaluated for other causes of pain abdomen before discharge.
Dr. Panchami, thank you. Nice presentation. Can you define what is non-specific abdominal pain?
Sir, when there is no...
There is definite definition for that. Can you define that? Non-specific abdominal pain. Okay, any abdominal pain more than 6 hours and less than 7 days. Can you tell me what is the drawback of Alvarado score for clinical decision? Can you tell me how will you use your Alvarado score for your clinical decision making? How will you use it?
Sir, if it is more than 7 points, it is suggestive of surgical intervention, need for surgical intervention. If it is less than 7, it can be treated conservatively.
Okay. So what do you think was the drawback?
And sir, if it is less than 3, appendicitis can be ruled out.
So for this patient, how much was it?
So it was 8.
Okay, but still you didn't find appendix, right?
Yes, sir.
So that is a clinical drawback in decision making.
So why you have not considered the diagnostic laparoscopy in this patient?
Sir, this case had come in the late evening, so the laparoscopic consultants were not available at that time.
What were the perioperative antibiotics used?
Sir, Metrogyl and Ceftriaxone.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Panchami.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that concludes the poster from MBJ Medical College. Next, I'll be handing it out to Dr. Nagbhushan sir.
Welcome, Dr. Nagbhushan sir.
Hi, good evening. This is Dr. Nagbhushan, and I have with me Dr. Neil Shetty from the Department of GI Surgery. Okay, so
Harish, I don't have names of people who are presenting.
Okay.
Please tell the names before they're presenting.
Okay, so you can see Dr. Manisha here. She's our fellow in gastrointestinal surgery. She's going to talk present a poster on persistent hypoglycemia, a very rare case of adult onset nesidioblastosis. Over to you, Manisha.
Thank you, sir. Good evening to one and all. I'm Dr. Manisha. I'm a fellow in surgical gastro, Department of Surgical Gastro, Gleneagles Global, Bangalore. I'm here to present a poster on a very rare case of persistent hypoglycemia, that is on nesidioblastosis, under the guidance of Dr. Nagbhushan sir and Dr. Neel Shetty. Nesidioblastosis is extremely rare entity. It is also called as non-insulinoma pancreaticogenous hyperinsulin syndrome. The incidence of this disease per se is very less. It is 0.3 per million patients. It should be considered as a differential diagnosis for persistent hypoglycemia with endogenous hyperinsulinism in adults with the possibility of space-occupying lesions when they are ruled out. The term nesidioblastosis was first coined by Laidlaw in 1938. It was first seen in infants. It was only after 1975 where it was even noted in the adult population. The diagnosis of nesidioblastosis should be considered in the evaluation of hypoglycemia because it mandates a different surgical approach. It is due to isolated hypoplastic beta cells of pancreas. Here the pancreatic beta cells are normal. It is a non-neoplastic condition. The beta cells are usually hypoplastic. So I come with the case presentation. Our patient was a 48-year-old gentleman who presented to us with a history of episodes of sudden loss of consciousness with documented evidence of hypoglycemia, where his GRBS used to reach less than 35, which was usually relieved by glucose intake. The symptoms aggravated and were persistent on food intake with colicky abdominal pain and flushing, which was persistent for last 5 years, and the symptoms were aggregated in last 1 year. On presenting to our hospital, the patient was underweight with a BMI of 11. Vitals were stable. A multidisciplinary team meeting was held, which included the surgical gastro, medical gastro, the hepatobiliary surgeon, the endocrinologist, and the and the oncologist. A panel of tests were performed, which was used to exclude the neuroendocrine tumors, insulinoma, and other possibilities. Then the strong possibility of nesidioblastosis was considered. The patient also had similar episodes of long-standing colicky abdominal pain, for which he underwent a surgery on pancreas in 2004, of which the data and reports are unavailable. The diagnosis of nesidioblastosis was made based on the symptoms of recurrent hypoglycemia, evidence of endogenous fasting hyperinsulinemia with negative fast test. The fasting insulin level in this patient was persistently high, that was 43 milli international units. The normal insulin levels, fasting insulin levels are less than 15. And finally, the diagnosis was made with a Dottonak PET CT scan. Here, the image shows there is increased focal discrete increased tracer uptake seen throughout the pancreas, which is suggestive of nesidioblastosis. The patient and the attenders were given the option of both total pancreatectomy and associated with diabetes and distal pancreatectomy and with the recurrence of the disease, possible recurrence of the disease. And the patient opted for distal pancreatectomy. A laparoscopic spleen preserving distal pancreatectomy was performed on the patient. As you can see, this is a specimen of the distal pancreas. On HP, there was pancreatic cell hyperplasia with large clear cytoplasm with large nuclei, and the diagnosis was confirmed by chromogranin A immunohistochemistry staining and synaptophysin staining. The final diagnosis was confirmed. Nesidioblastosis is more a clinical diagnosis of exclusion and based on exclusion of insulinoma. Somatostatin receptor-based imaging is the functional imaging modality of choice. Initially, the medical line of management includes dietary control, medical therapy with somatostatin analogs, and surgery is preserved in patients with intractable symptoms. The extent of pancreatic resection requires maintaining a delicate balance between the need of adequate debulking the hypoplastic islet cells while preserving enough beta cells to prevent the patient from developing diabetes.
The time is up. You can continue.
Inadequate or partial pancreatic resection can lead to recurrence of the symptoms. Yes, and these are my references. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Manisha, very rare case, nice case to look at. Can you tell me a surgical condition where you will see symptoms like nesidioblastosis?
Sir, VIPoma is one where you can
After,
see.
okay,
Yes, sir.
I meant to ask, do you see nesidioblastosis like symptoms after any particular surgery?
Dumping syndrome, sir, following gastrectomy, total gastrectomy.
How will you differentiate between post Roux-en-Y nesidioblastosis-like symptoms and the one what you presented right now? Anything particular you look at or anything?
Yes, sir. Even in bariatric procedures, you can see nesidioblastosis-like symptoms where there is hyperplasia of the beta cells, hyperplasia of the beta cells, sir. But the insulin levels are where you're supposed to monitor, sir. In nesidioblastosis, the fasting insulin levels are pretty low, sir. They're pretty high, sir. They're more than 50 sometimes.
Okay. Any drug that you will consider?
So otide, somatostatin analog, that is otide, is initially considered as a medical line of treatment, which will definitely reduce the secretion. But in our patient, the disease was intractable and the patient was really, really bothered by the symptoms. Henceforth, we prefer surgery, sir.
What about alpha glucosidase inhibitors? Any role of those alpha glucosidase inhibitors?
So initially they added, sir, but there is no significant relief of symptoms, sir, especially in nesidioblastosis, sir.
Okay, what was the dose of otide what you recommend?
Sir, 100 mcg TID is the dose, sir.
Okay, what is the complication that you normally see, that you normally read with otides?
So the normal complication with otide is stasis of the bile, sir, leading to calculous cholecystitis.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Venkat sir, if you want to ask anything, sir.
Yes, sir.
Did this patient, what is the risk of this patient in the long run if you have removed this much amount of distal pancreas?
Sir, the risk of diabetes is pretty high in this patient, sir.
And when it happens, this diabetes will be?
Brittle diabetes, sir.
Brittle diabetes, very
Yes,
difficult
sir.
to manage. Good.
Yes, sir.
Okay, continue.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manisha. I would leave the stage for Dr. Varsha, who is our fellow in minimally invasive surgery. She's going to talk on total pancreatectomy for neuroendocrine tumor of the pancreas.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Varsha, doing fellowship in minimal invasive surgery in Gleneagles Global Hospital. Today, I'm going to talk about a case presentation on a neuroendocrine tumor in pancreas who underwent total pancreatectomy. So total pancreatectomy was first introduced in 1943 by Roque, and the technique was further described by Ross in 1954. It is used in the management of pancreatic adenocarcinomas, multifocal or diffuse pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors, IPMN, that is intraductal papillary mucinous neoplasm, and in selected case of chronic pancreatitis. However, total pancreatectomy can cause insufficiency of endocrine and exocrine with severe metabolic outcomes like steatohepatitis, malabsorption, difficult glycemic control, and liver failure. So moving on to the case report, she was a 52-year-old lady who is a known case of diabetes, hypertension, presented with upper abdominal pain and back pain since 1.5 years. She had a history of loss of appetite and loss of weight. She complains of nausea and vomiting intermittently since 6 months. Clinically, her vitals were stable. On per abdomen examinations, no abnormality detected. The lab results revealed elevated chromogranin levels up to 2,220 nanogram per milliliter, and CA99 was normal, and rest of the laboratory investigations were unremarkable. CECT and Dotona PET-CT showed a brilliantly enhancing lesion with diffuse involvement of the entire body and tail of the pancreas, as you can see in the CT's image, and as well as it was extension of tumor was there into the pancreatic head. There was a short segment infiltration of the portal vein as well. In the portal venous space, we can see. And then the Dotonok PET activity showed activity was seen in the pancreatic body, tail, and as well as the head. EUS showed extensive tumor vascularity, whereas lesion and biopsy we were not able to do because of the increased vascularity. After multidisciplinary team discussion, which included the surgical gastro team and medical gastro team, then hepatobiliary surgeons, as well as oncologists, and pre-anesthetic evaluation was done for the patient, and relatives were counseled regarding the need for lifelong insulin and as well as pancreatic enzyme replacement therapy. Exploratory laparotomy was done with total pancreatectomy, splenectomy, portal vein resection and portal vein reconstruction was done. Hepaticojejunostomy with gastrojejunostomy with cholecystectomy was done. Gastric congestion was seen, due to which we had to do interposition vein graft. We had between the left gastric vein and portal vein was carried forward. Then after, as you can see, there was the image shows you the reconstruction which we had to do between the left gastric vein and portal vein, and as well as this is a resected specimen on the right hand side. So post-operative recovery was uneventful. Glycemic profile managed with insulin and pancreatic enzymes supplemented started post-operatively. Post-operative Doppler showed good portal venous flow. So a histopathology report suggestive of pancreatic well-differentiated neuroendocrine tumor, grade 2, with lymphovascular invasion, which was positive for cytokeratin, synaptophysin, chromogranin A, with Ki67 expression being 10 to 11%. Discussion, the overall morbidity and mortality after total pancreatectomy has shown a decreasing trend over the past few decades and is 31 to 49% and 0 to 8.5% respectively. Improvements in anesthesia, operative techniques, insulin and pancreatic enzyme replacements have improved the results. So preoperative counseling is done has to be done as there will be lifelong need of insulin and pancreatic enzyme replacement therapy. Thank you.
Dr. Varsha, thank you. Very challenging surgery to do. Spleen was removed?
Yes, sir. Spleen was removed.
When did you vaccinate the patient?
So we vaccinated already 3 weeks prior to the surgery itself.
If you're not vaccinated the patient 3 weeks before, when do you vaccinate?
So before the discharge, we can vaccinate the patient.
What is the ideal time you would prefer?
So ideal time is since it's an elective surgery, at least 2 to 3 weeks.
No. I'm telling in case if emergency, if you have removed a spleen.
Yes, sir.
And post-operative, if you have to vaccinate, when will you vaccinate?
So 1 to 2 weeks is fine. 1 week is
2 weeks. Okay, can you tell me a difference between conversion pancreatectomy and completion pancreatectomy? Conversion pancreatectomy. What do you mean by conversion total pancreatectomy? When do you do it?
Sir, I think intraoperatively during the procedure, if we see there was an invasion, then we have to go for a complete total pancreatectomy. And if it's already we have decided for a total pancreatectomy, then that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Varsha.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.